Hello and welcome to Backstory, the show about books, the craft of writing, and the people behind the lines. I'm Mel Cranenburgh, and good to be with you here today for this, my last edition of Backstory for 2020, live and live streamed across all the RRR socials. So please do join us. A huge thanks to Arij today for the wrap. I just love that feeling of walking in on something amazing when I wander into the station for my show each week. And you can catch the wrap every Wednesday from 9 until 12 or catch up on old episodes or new feels over the summer, all streaming on rrr.org.au. And don't forget to subscribe to some RRR podcasts over the summer too, including this show. There is plenty to listen to and your ears will thank you. I will be with you here until 1 p.m. today when I hand over to the ever lovely Beth AQ and the Glass House for more stories about storytellers. But before I start, I would like to acknowledge that I'm broadcasting today on the lands of the original storytellers of this place, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, here where their sovereignty was never ceded. I pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and those of all other Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander or First Nations people who may be tuning in today. On today's show, I worked on my story. I pulled things out of thin air. I dragged stuff out of chaos. The moment when working of diary material as a basis, I begin to invent, like the first moment on an unsupported two-wheeler or ice skates, letting go, doing it on my own. That's an excerpt from one of many elliptical moments that fly in and fly out from Helen Garner's collection of material from her diaries spanning 1987 to 1995, titled One Day I'll Remember This. Helen Garner is the acclaimed author of novels, short stories, screenplays, long-form articles and essays, and, of course, numerous non-fiction titles. Her sharp use of language and mastery of form has left an indelible imprint on Australian writing and writers. And she joins me now for a very special long-form live-streamed episode to discuss her writing life, and more specifically, her recently published second volume of Diaries, Helen Garner. A very warm welcome to Backstory.
Thank you. Thanks, Mel. It's happy to be here.
Well, I was talking to you off air, Helen, and I was lucky enough to be able to interview you last time you published a collection of your diaries, which was the Yellow Notebook, and that collection predates you've just released, which is this lovely edition here that I have in hard case. And as you can see from all my many notes, I had a great time going through it. Again, I was struck by how you could read this book, and I found myself skipping around. It's sort of like a readerly, I should say, Rorschach test for what it is that you want to find in someone's words. I particularly obviously was interested in, in your kind of musings about writing. So I'm intrigued, Helen, when you went back through old Helen or past Helen, what things did you pick up afresh?
You mean about the writing parts of it or
About
anything at all?
your diaries, like what? Because I was really intrigued by something you said in a kind of very sort of meta way. You talk about reading old diaries and that actually you don't relate to the character in those pages, that you don't relate to this story about love that they're talking about, the person that they're in love with. You don't even have a feeling about that anymore, and you realize, life is for the moment. So I wonder what it's like to reacquaint yourself with, these old diaries now as you've gone through with a real editor's eye. What kind of things really struck you afresh?
My foolishness, I suppose, is when I was younger. It's actually quite shocking to read a contemporaneous account of a period of your life that's passed, with all the detail that you've forgotten. Naturally, we all have memories of our lives. Sometimes we think we remember our life as a stream running along. Sometimes we think of our past as just a series of quick snaps, quick, tiny moments. But when you get both of them at once in a record that you yourself have kept, it's often, I mean, some of it's familiar, some of it is really refreshing to read, some little moment. Usually it's there's a lot of stuff in this book about weather and climate. I mean, not climate, but what's outside the window or what happens when you walk along the street. Mostly I love those bits and they make me feel happy, but the bits that I find mortifying are all the sort of mushy crap about being in love, which never survives. I mean, because being in love is a kind of well, I was about to say a manic state. Sometimes it's manic, but it's a state in which you can make a lot of terrible, terrible mistakes. And to look back at the contemporaneous account of a series of actions can be really quite shocking, to see how obsessed you were and how you walked past again and again moments where a person with their wits about them would have said, I don't think I'll go on with this. I think this would be a good door to go out through. And of course you don't, because that's the whole point of love, that it's meant to sort of sweep you along into whatever it's meant to sweep you along into. I don't know what that is.
It's so interesting you say that, because when you do write about love and your partner or partners, you really seem very clear-eyed. You don't write about them with that sort of glaze that love sometimes puts over people. You get this real insight into their flaws, into their pomposities, into their into the genuine them, which, when you love someone, you ameliorate, but you don't on the page. The insightful writer's sharp knife is always applied, even to the people that you are, or maybe especially to the people that you write about here that are obviously those closest to you.
Well, that's a very interesting observation. I suppose it doesn't, but what you point out as sort of a sharp-eyed noticing of things about a person, somehow in the early stages of being in love with someone, you can notice yourself blue in the face, but it doesn't affect this passionate drive that you're in. You're in a different world when you're in love, even if you think, oh, look, that was a bit mean, or why was he so X, naming some unfortunate characteristic. But there's some other current that you're being carried along by at those times, and so is the other person. I mean, I always feel that the other person is noticing me just as mercilessly as one does. But that doesn't, because the thing is, if you took those little moments of what you sharply notice about another person as the whole story of their character, you'd be awfully lonely. I mean, the world would be, you would be completely solipsistically adrift, as it were. I think so. It'd be you people. And the older you get, the more you notice this, that everybody's got their faults and their little kinks of nature. And you can love someone in spite of those things. I think, is that what I'm saying? Yeah.
Well, I mean, look, clearly that's the case. I think there's something else that you say in this where you're going out to a film with someone and, you are determined that you cannot love a happy ending, that you need to squeeze the kind of, the hard or hurtful truths out of those things. And I feel like there is that sense of that repellent sense in terms of how you write, where you're obviously in love with beauty, the beauty of words, the beauty of things around you, but you pull yourself back. I remember listening to an interview with you where you sort of said your anxiety is in adverbs. And I wonder as well, is it also in these other ideas of, maybe overly fuzziness or, indulging in a happy ending? Are these also things that writers should be wary of?
Well, there's happy endings that are earned, by the story. And there are happy endings that are just kind of gummed on the end because you can't stand to see the truth or to say the truth about a situation. Obviously, I mean, like everybody, I love a happy ending. I love a story that resolves itself in a way that's either graceful or beautiful or resigned in a comical way, or that in some stories or books you get a sort of an explosion of joy at the end, and that's a wonderful thing. But a happy ending, yeah, the very idea of it seems not complex enough for me. I think that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think, I mean, we're reading through these diaries, and of course, these are, small excerpts from life. Some things may have been left out, obviously. You really do get the sense that this sharp observation of yours defies that kind of simplicity in life, but does cut through to the beauty of it as well. You also have this wonderful sense of language, its pacing, its ability to evoke. And even though these were originally not written for public view, I remember at one moment you reflect that you love your notebooks, you loved your typed up notebooks, and you think of them as sharper and in some ways better than say a novel, and in fact that you want to knock down that hierarchy that puts the novel above such writing. Do you in fact feel like this your diary is in fact some of your greatest work?
Well, I don't know about greatest or great, but
Or the work you're proudest of, perhaps?
well, I do feel a sort of pride of it, but I can't exactly put my finger on. I know the passage you're referring to, where somewhere in the diary I said, that I picked up an old notebook and looked at it and thought there was something so fresh in there, because it wasn't when I was writing it, I was free. I wasn't trying to write a novel. I didn't have that sort of the anxiety of the demands of form hanging over me. And plainly, I don't want, I'm grumbling away about the novel being often placed at the top of the hierarchy of forms. I actually think poetry is way up there above the novel. But I do feel that there are, and I think this is what's been happening in recent years, and it may be something to do with the number of women that are now confident to put their work out there and finding that they are, forcing the world to accept their work. I think maybe that's one of the things about women's writing that has sort of blown some of that rigidity out of the water, so that a work that's fragmentary, a work like, for example, Jenny Offel's work, which is fragmented in a way that I just totally adore and respond to on a very deep level. I find I love fragmented things, and I love the way that your mind will pause and then take a breath and then leap to the next one and leap to the next one. And then you can stop for a while and you can go away and stew on it. And you aren't at the mercy of this overmastering sort of muscle bound form that's kind of keeping your nose to the grindstone, which I think in a great novel can be a wonderful thing, if you just hand yourself over to that mighty stream, which has been very consciously created. But by the same token, there's just that joy in the smallness of things and how they add up to something that you couldn't quite have predicted.
I did wonder when I was reading this if I hadn't started to think of the novel as a life support system for these kind of serendipitous moments of sudden realization, and you just distilled it all for me. So when I open this show, I always go through the books that I read to try and find that moment in the book that really speaks to me, that says something, that tells the audience something. And I was absolutely floored when I read this about where I would start, because there were so many of those moments. And again, to refer to another interview that you did, I remember you saying that you were surprised when you released your first collection of diary excerpts, that at how not unique you were. And I think by that, what you meant is that you struck on this universality, that you gave people some, a language to describe certain moments and feelings. That is really the mark of a great writer, though. That's what you do. You speak a thought that we couldn't articulate before, or as I prefer to think of it, you articulate a thought I wish I'd had.
That's funny. Well, actually, I'm surprised to find in sort of personal responses I've got to these two books of diaries, how many people say this could have been my marriage, or I completely, you've said things that I couldn't quite get into words about something that's deeply familiar to me. And that's what I meant when I had that feeling after Yellow Notebook came out, just that feeling that I wasn't alone, that I'm just not this weirdo who's hanging her guts out on the line, but that the things that are important to me and that struck me as important enough to record and to sort of work at recording are actually things that I share with a gazillion people on the planet. And that to me is completely thrilling.
Yeah, I mean, it does, communing with a writer in some ways. And we're living in an era, of course, of people sort of wearing their hearts on their sleeve or ostensibly doing it. Blogging led to, of course, social media, which is a much more immediate form of putting things out there. But there's a highly curated element to that as well. When you're sitting with a book, when you're kind of feeling like you're having a moment with another writer's mind, there's something so deeply intimate about that feeling. To add to that the layer of it being a diary, that does give you another kind of level of engagement. Do you feel like, and I'm interested in this as well, I think you might have even referred to Chekhov's notebooks, I think, in this book as well. Do you find, is there another writer's diaries that you read yourself or have read yourself or have similar feelings about?
I haven't read a huge number of notebooks or diaries. I mean, naturally, I've read Virginia Woolf's, and first of that little one that her husband pulled out of the biggest one, the one called A Writer's Diary, I think. I read that way back in the 70s, and I just adored it. And then I've read the bigger, fatter one, and I love to kind of wander and ramble in the book, and I find that her mind. And her, not just her mind, but her way of noticing things, very congenial. And I think most people who read it do. But I've read one person's notebooks that I really liked is Peter Hanke, the Austrian writer, who's lately fallen from favour because he got involved with a whole lot of really scary Balkan guys after the Balkan Wars happened. And he made a lot of really scary statements and people began to sort of, I suppose, cancel him. But there's a book of his called The Weight of the World, that is Weight, which I loved and found really kind of inspiring. I think I quoted from him once or twice. And though actually it's interesting to think, I've read a big fat diary by a guy whose name I've forgotten, a Polish guy. This is really embarrassing. But I read in the Times Literary Supplement, I read one of those things where people say what they're going to read on this particular summer. And this woman had said, I'm going to read Gombrowicz, or whoever the hell the guy was, his diaries that had just been published. She said, and this is what made me want to read them. And she quoted this little bit where he said, what I did today was I went to the post office, and then when I got home, I made myself a sandwich and then I ate it. I thought, God, I love that. That complete casualness and concentration on that sort of pleasure taken in making a note that you would think would be completely boring afterwards and of no interest whatsoever to another human being. Suddenly, just because of the light, his attention fell upon this sandwich. He didn't even say what it was like. But she said, when I read that, I went straight out and bought the book. And I thought, that is a wonderful thing.
Well, I mean, I guess that's the premise of social media, isn't it, really? That like these kind of casual thoughts that we have are things that people really want to know, particularly if they've got a kind of oddness to them or, add a sort of note of humour. You have these little sort of snippets of ideas that really do drop in for the reader, including, I think there was one where you talk about that you've been spending, you're swimming in a kind of milieu of people who are, for generations or for years, you've been swimming in a milieu of people who are younger than you.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a really interesting reflection at that time, particularly because you then talked about your then current partner being your own age and that not necessarily being something you were used to. I would love you to speak to that, because there is these themes that run throughout it of being someone who's an established writer, who's in those kind of years of their life when they're not young, but they're certainly not old either.
Not quite sure what you're asking me there.
No, I guess just this kind of, I guess that spoke to me as well. It's like, is that, that these kinds of things that strike you where you think about, how am I living my life? And and where do I sit?
You mean when you sort of take a step back and have a look?
Yeah.
Or else something, well, there is one thing that this brought to mind was that in this diary, I described going to lunch with some friends of my generation and talk about how we all sat at the table and told stories to make each other laugh. And then I said something like this, but I was shocked by the nastiness of what one of the men was saying, the nasty, spiteful things that he was saying. And then I said, I am used to living with teenagers. They have no bitterness.
Yes.
And when I came back across that, when I found that in the diary, I was really surprised. I'd forgotten having ever thought that or noticed it. But I thought that it was one of those moments of, it would never occur to me now to think, why do I like teenagers? It's because they've got no bitterness. But it came to me out of seeing the bitterness that people of my generation sometimes display and suffer from, and feeling glad that I wasn't, that I hadn't yet reached that stage, or perhaps that I didn't have to live with that, because I lived with, my daughter and the guy who I call in the book the law student. And so these are people who was just starting out in life, and they were sort of eager for experience, and they had not, they hadn't become disillusioned and sour and always looking on the dark side. And that's one of the things I just loved about being with people younger than me. But of course, now people, I'll be 80 in 2 years, and people are younger than me who are only 70, and that seems quite young to me. So these things change.
The idea of looking at your generation out of time, or your milieu out of time, it kind of reminded me of the start of, or portions from Orlando, the Virginia Woolf novel, which I was obsessed with for a very long time, where you're
That's a wonderful book. Yeah.
Yeah, she does reflect upon that in terms of, a writerly capturing of the spirit of the age, I think is what she talks about. But what I love about this is that you do have this kind of commentary on the spirit of the age, both from within it and from without it, as a writer as well. And I think, getting these reflections of you at a particular point in time is really interesting. Looking back, how do you feel now about those times? Do you think you see them differently than that person? Do you think that you actually are noticing that you were noticing things about that time that you didn't realize?
Oh, yes. There's a lot of, yes, it's quite surprising when you go back over something that's 30 years. You notice, well, there's a lot of little morsels in there about political things that were happening at the same time. Things that I saw on TV, like, Tiananmen Square, and the falling of the Berlin Wall and things like that. And just when I came across those, I was really, really pleased to find they were there, because I never set out, when keeping the diary, to keep any sort of record of the political life around me. I wasn't that, I've never found, that's never been a sort of central interest of mine. But I was kind of happy to realise that my mind was kind of porous, if you like, that those things did find their way in, and they kind of date it in a way that I feel happy about. They place it in time. Like, for example, I'm sitting with the person I called V in the book, who I was married to, and and a woman of our generation, and we were watching Kerry Packer being interviewed on TV, and the three of us had different responses to him. And I said, "Oh, he's horrible. He's a horrible toad-like huge bully." And the other woman who was there said, "Oh, I think he's marvelous. I'm just swept away by his power." And at the time I thought, really? And so I thought, I'll just write that down. And the person called V said, "Oh yeah," and he was talking about Robert Maxwell, who was another very powerful media guy, the father of Ghislaine Maxwell, but be that as it may. And he said, "Yes, isn't it marvelous the way he bestrides the world?" And I'm sitting there thinking, gosh, there are some people who actually admire that stuff, which repels me. But so that little incident is kind of illuminating to me about myself, but also about those two people, and about the fact that some people admire power and are drawn to it, and which is rather a mysterious phenomenon in my view.
Yeah, absolutely. There is something that I've been dying to ask you as well, because I was thinking about, there's this Heinrich Boll short story that I became obsessed with. We're just going to talk about my obsessions.
Go ahead. I'm sure we share them.
Yes. And it's called Merker's Collected Silences. And in it,
I know that one. Yes.
It's such a great story. There's this, a radio editor who it's after the Second World War in Germany, so you can imagine. And there's a very pompous radio announcer, and this radio producer has been tasked with cutting and changing his old speeches, and not just to cut out things about where he said positive stuff about Hitler, no doubt, but also to change the actual, I think it's like, in fact, the tense of the sentences, or something as specific as that. He wanted to have one whole kind of tense removed from his speeches. And I thought about that, and I thought, you're putting your diaries out there, and you openly state, you've said it in interviews, you say it yourself in your diary, that you don't want to shy from hard truths. You don't want to hide from things that you're uncomfortable with. What is it like putting things out there that you may no longer agree with, or that may not reflect your thoughts anymore? I mean, people delete tweets now that they don't
really do they? That's extraordinary. I'm not on social media, so all this is astonishing and weird to me, the whole. But they delete tweets. Yeah,
well, something that you might have said that was ill-advised when you were, just mitigated, putting things out there when you were a young person, and you're ashamed of it now, and you don't want that to represent you. How do you feel about letting this stuff sit? Because it's a real act of bravery.
Well, I don't see it as an act of bravery so much as I'm not scared, put it that way. I mean, bravery is a different thing from not being scared. I just think, okay, well, that's what I thought then. And if it was a memoir, I think this is a point I might have made to you in our previous interview. If it was a memoir, it would be very tempting for me to say, oh, look what I said there. I wouldn't say that now, but I'm going to place it now so that you can see that now I'm more sensitive and more virtuous, and I have, resolved certain aspects of my nature. And look at that back there, and wasn't I awful? I think, well, that to me is a kind of cop-out. I think, for example, in this book, I go to, no, this is in the previous book. I drove up to, and Uluru in those days was known still as Ayers Rock, and I climbed it. And this was in the, mid-80s, I suppose. And I climbed it with the guy that I met at the base. We just climbed to the top, and it was a most staggering and wonderful and extraordinary experience for me. There was no one there because it was dawn, and I felt grateful for that, and glad about it. But then, of course, when some young journalist he interviews me about the book, he says, I can't remember what he actually said about it, but he said, I noticed that you climbed Uluru. And I said, well, back in those days, it was not a common thing. The whole idea of not climbing Uluru and it's being somehow outrageous to Indigenous sensitivities and spirits was not a common thing. I mean, that's not the way people thought about it in those days. And I thought, well, I'll just put it in there. And so he mentioned this. I gave some sort of answer to it. And when the piece was published, the subs had put a title: Garner refuses to apologise, to regret having climbed Uluru. And I thought, oh, fuck you. I thought, I think that is absolutely pathetic. What my thought is about having climbed Uluru is not in the book. It's not there because the form of the book does not allow me to comment on that. Now, I could have cut it out, but I didn't want to cut it out because it was a true thing that happened. And I thought, well, let people think what they want. I'm not going to apologise for it. If an Indigenous person came to me and said, and laid it before me, that would be a different matter. But I'm not going to censor myself in advance. That's what I'm saying. And I think there's a hell of a lot of that going on at the moment, and it really revolts and sickens me, the way people are just constantly traumatized. Like yesterday I said this and now I'll have to get down on my knees in case someone might have been offended. I think, what is the matter with this insane hypersensitivity and self-censorship and eagerness to censor other people's quite genuine descriptions or accounts of their ways of seeing the world? I find this completely anti-life, ludicrous and grotesque. And that's my statement.
I do want to come back to that, definitely. But if you've just joined us, you're listening to Backstory on Triple R. I'm Mel Cranenburgh, and today I'm talking with Helen Garner, one of Australia's most well-known and acclaimed authors, about her collection of diaries spanning 1987 to 1995. One day I'll remember this. But we're going to play a few sponsorship announcements, take a quick break, and we'll be back again with Helen Garner after that. Just join us. You're listening to Backstory on Triple R. I'm Mel Cranenburgh, and today I am doing a special long-form interview live streamed with Helen Garner, one of Australia's most acclaimed authors. We are focusing on her collection of diaries spanning 1987 to 1995. This is my very well bookmarked copy. It's called One Day I'll Remember this. Helen, just before we took a quick break, you were talking about putting the things that you have said and done up unvarnished, unchanged, and not pretending that they didn't happen, not changing what actually happened. But I am intrigued, actually, because we all change our views on things and we all change how we look at things, which is quite a different thing than what you were talking about. And in this book, you do reflect on a particular period of time in 1995 when you published the book The First Stone. There was quite a reaction to it, and you talk in some of your entries about your feelings about the kind of reactions there. I'm really interested now, looking back, and perhaps reading some of the things that were said, some of the things you experienced, what your thoughts now are about that episode.
You mean about what happened at Ormond College?
Yeah,
And
well, not so much that, but the reaction to it,
yeah.
your own feelings about it, because you have just put here, I mean, it's tempting for the modern reader to think that these are comments that you're making now, but they're not. They're, of course, diary entries from 1995. So I'm interested, with now 25 years, past this event, what your feelings are when it's not so raw. Like, how do you reflect upon that period?
Okay. Yes. Well, it's actually a very complicated time, and when I got to that point in the diaries that form the basis of this book, I was quite surprised to find not very much about it in there, about the experience of writing it and publishing it. And I realised that was because as soon as I started work on it as a project, I started a journal which was only about that book. And that's what I always do with those big, those big long projects, especially the ones involving trials and court cases. I have a big notebook that's devoted purely to that, and it's like a diary. Every day I write, this is what happened today, this is what I learned, this is what I felt, and so forth. And that becomes the spine of the book. So I was surprised, before I remembered that, to find quite little material in this diary, and what most of what is in the diary is about the reception of the book, which was extremely hostile. That is the reception that it got from particularly university feminists. And I look back on the book and I see that it was extremely provocative. I mean, part of, the last few pages of it are really a red rag to a bull. But the book itself, I don't think is, I think it's much more complex than people gave it credit for at the time. I think one thing that happened was that there's nothing people love so much as watching somebody renege on a previous statement. I think people rushed out and bought this book because they thought, yo, this is a feminist who's now turning her back on feminism and she's going to kick the shit out of feminism. And I think that's one reason why the book sold such a lot of copies, because people wanted to witness some kind of what they imagine will be destructive behavior. But I was shocked by the savagery, the personal savagery, I think, of some of the responses. I made a couple of enemies. There are still people who cut me dead in public places. I've just got used to that. It happened quite a lot at the time. Dirty looks through cafe windows, scorching looks and horrible letters and things like that. But it was actually extremely ugly and painful for a while. But what I learned from it was that several things I learned. Firstly, that there's that to be hated by people who don't know you, and some who do know you, is quite sort of strengthening. It puts iron in your soul. And if you can survive that, you're free afterwards. That's one thing. The second thing is, this is something that came to me while you were talking about how it feels to publish in an unvarnished way things that you thought 30 years ago. I have never wanted to have the last word. That's very important to me, to understand and to acknowledge that what I'm thinking about something at any given moment cannot possibly be the last word on that matter. And I think one thing I've learned in my longish life is that the struggle between men and women is eternal. It's never going to be resolved. It's one of those struggles that women make advances, and many wonderful things have changed as a result of feminist activity and feminist thinking. But you see, when I was a feminist, when I was first a feminist back in the very early 70s, I mean, and I'm sure some of the others, really thought we were going to change things. I mean, we were so naive. I remember thinking, firstly, it was like coming up out of a fog or out of water and sticking my head out and looking around, taking the first deep breath of my life and thinking, now I get it. This explains everything. And that's the convert's feeling about whatever she or he has been converted to. It's like, you know, a born again Christian. Now I get it. This theory, or someone who becomes a communist, or whatever the thing is that they're converted to, this way of thinking or a world picture. You think, now I get it. This is why I've always felt so terrible. Now I'm going to work on this. And when I get with all the other people I'm going to work with, we're going to change the world, and we're going to explain to men what they do that's making us so miserable. And they'll go, oh, is that what you mean? Oh, I get it. Oh, well, we won't do that anymore. I mean, really, sounds completely pathetic. But that was the way we thought. We thought that you could change people's minds by argument. And plainly, there are some minds that can be changed by argument, but not nearly as many as we hope there are. And so other things have to be changed by force, or by changing the law, or the long, slow, grinding process of change. But the wonderful explosions of illumination are few and far between. And I think for that reason, partly out of that comes my feeling that nothing I say on any subject is the last word. And so people can attack as they will and disagree with me as they will. And my aim is not to take things as an insult, not to be insulted by somebody disagreeing with me.
Do you feel like, so to take that idea of you not being the last word, do you feel like because you are someone who people have had these relationships with in their mind, with things you've written, with works you've made, the fact that you were such an enormous voice and remain such an enormous voice in Australian literature, that there is this real expectation that you will be that person always, that you will be someone that people will always like and always agree with? Do you think that there is that expectation of a public figure that you've once felt allied with, that you will always feel allied with? And what do you do with that?
What do I do with it, or what other?
Yeah, what does one do with that? Because surely you also experience this. I think it is a very human phenomenon that you feel like, even though I've read this book by Helen Garner, I feel like I know Helen Garner. And suddenly Helen Garner's not acting like Helen Garner, or the Helen Garner I want her to be. I'm sure you've experienced that with your own relationships with public figures.
Yes, I have. Yes,
so
indeed. Well, that's why one has to be flexible. I mean, it's quite. I get letters from people saying, I'm really disappointed that you wrote such and such a book. How could you have done that? And then somebody who when the first stone was reissued on some 25th anniversary or something, and a journalist, quite a well-known journalist, wrote this, what I thought was an absolutely soppy article saying, my copy of Monkey Grip, it was all bedraggled and torn. I loved it. It was such an important book. And then she turns around and publishes the first stone. So the rest of the article was, an attack on my views. That's fine with me. But I just thought all that stuff up the front about how I used to think she was so fabulous, and then she kind of turned, just deeply pathetic. I mean, grow up. People don't have to stay the same. And if they did, what sort of an artist would you be if you painted yourself into a corner like that?
So I guess the question is as well, if you are, as you are such an enormous voice to so many people, is there also a responsibility that comes with that? And if so, you've sort of you've more than intimated, you've stated that your responsibility is to truth, to the words, to the work. But is there also a responsibility to the audience?
No, not the. I don't think one has a responsibility to sort of stay with what you thought was the case 30 years ago. I think a writer's or an artist's responsibility is to be constantly responsive to the way things are now, at this moment now. It doesn't mean you lose contact with the past or with traditions or with the stabilities of the past, but it's a terrible thing to sort of get stuck, and you're no use to anyone if you get stuck. Then you become just like this sort of little statue that's over there, and people to which people attribute sort of magical powers, and that's just ridiculous. I think any artist worth their salt has got to be feeling the way things are going and find a way to respond to that in their work, not necessarily by talking about it directly, but you've got to absorb the currents of what's going on. So and your currents within yourself, the changes that happen within a person and how they sort of meld or clash with what's going on outside.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about a slightly more liminal or slight element that runs through this collection. You mentioned that there's those little moments that people gravitate towards, like, for example, someone, mentioning a sandwich or mentioning the weather. For me, it was you mentioning what you listened to when you're writing, or what you were listening to at the time. And I think throughout, I'm going to say 1998, you seem to be listening to a lot of Bartok. And I think at one stage you even say, because many people might not know that you also have written screenplays, and you have written a number, and in this book you talk about writing The Last Days of Chez Nous, and that you think that that a certain track by Bartok really is the mood that you wanted to get for that writing. So I'm sort of intrigued. Do you use music as a way into your writing, or is there a soundtrack you're listening to now that's inspiring you?
I don't. I actually listen to. I've been rather surprised at how little music. What little music I listened to during the lockdown. Somehow I hardly listened to music at all, and that's pretty unusual. But no, I don't. For example, I would never listen to music while I was working, and I wouldn't. It's more what you're talking about there, that I'm trying to figure out for myself a sort of a mood or a tone that I'm trying to get in a piece of writing, and I might just accidentally listen to a bit of Bartok and think, oh yeah, that's what I want. I want that sort of spiky, weird, uncomfortable feeling. Or if I'm in a mess in my head, I might go and listen to some Bach. I might listen to some counterpoint, something that's two hands working against each other. And those are things that I wouldn't kind of consciously try to model what I'm writing on music, but it's really more sort of mood and what sort of instruments are used, whether it's fully orchestral or just a piano or a trumpet.
Yeah, so a sort of sense of mood is coming from the music. The other thing that I, of course, loved was the references to what books you were reading throughout, throughout the times that are covered in this diary. And I remember in another interview that you did where you talked about that you often forget the books that you've read. And I really relate to this because I read such a lot. And I'd say this is probably one of those things that happens when you do read a lot, that you actually forget some of the specifics, or you forget that you've read the book. Very often someone will say to me, have you read blah, blah, blah book? And I'll just go, no, as a default. And then they start to describe it and I'm like, oh yeah, I read that. And actually I interviewed the author, and then I feel terrible because you know, at the time, as you also say, I loved it, or I was very engaged with it. So I kind of thought about this as well, where you sort of said you feel like, you know, you read, you know, you were surrounded by words, you read books like you were swimming through them, that it was difficult to differentiate the little droplets as well. Is this part of a writing life? You know, is it that you are accumulating these influences sometimes without even realizing it, and then the ghosts of them end up in your work?
Oh yes, I think I think most influence people. When you ask a writer who's influenced them, I mean, if anybody asks me that, I always go blank. I find it a very hard thing to answer. But I think, and then after the interview, all sorts of thoughts come to me. But I think that most influence is semi-conscious. You know, I mean, especially if you're the kind of person who, since childhood, has just read and read and read and read, and that's sort of the main thing you do in life is to read. You can't possibly have a sharp memory of everything you read. Have you read that book called How to Talk About Books You Haven't Read?
No, I haven't, but
it's marvelous because I mean, it sounds like a joke book, but it's actually really quite sophisticated, and it relieves a lot of anxiety. But I think in the diary I quoted Gerald Murnane, the Australian writer Gerald Murnane, saying that he often doesn't he read a lot of books, and that he doesn't remember in detail, but what he does remember is how he felt while he was reading them, and sort of the effect that the book had on him. And it's as if each book that's any good sort of radiates a little world, and you get into it for a while and you stay in that world. And sometimes it deeply affects you, and it stays sort of on your nerve ends for a long time, and that's how its influence might manifest in your work. For example, Raymond Carver. I read a lot of Raymond Carver when he was, you know, first publishing, and he really had an enormous effect on me. I wasn't reading him on purpose to write like him, but I was so thunderstruck by how little there is on the page, and yet how detailed this story is. I mean, he's a writer who, the Raymond Carver world is one that I can walk into in my memory and my imagination. I may not remember the name of the book or the name of the story, but there's some kind of gas that his work exudes that I gratefully breathe, and it's still there.
I want to also talk just finally, because it looks like it's amazing, or nearly at the end of our hour, just really quickly, Helen, if you don't mind sort of saying, or, you know, giving me a sense here of what it's like to put your diaries out there, because I remember interviewing an author once who wrote incredibly personal stuff about her life, her loves, her mental health, but she said she absolutely would not share stuff about her cat, because that was just for her. Her cat was just for her. That was too personal. And so I'm really intrigued by that, because we have a very different sense of what it is that you're exposing yourself. And you are a writer who's often drawn on the very personal aspects of your life. But are there things that people might not think of that are far too personal for you to be putting out there in your diaries?
Oh yes, if people think I've scrapped the bottom of the barrel, that I haven't. No, there's plenty. I couldn't just offhand tell you what it was, but I can tell you that there's a lot of stuff in the diaries that I cut. But it wasn't usually because it was too personal about me. It was because I felt that it was about another person, and that it was nobody's business. It wasn't anybody's public business. And the fact that there are some things I know, or that people have told me about themselves, that while they're telling them to me, I know that I would never, ever repeat this thing. And some of these things I don't write down. Sometimes people say to me, I'm telling you this, do not ever write about this. And I say, okay, I won't. And so those are the things I don't write down. I don't even jot them down. But that's mostly what I would... and there are some things that are beyond my power to articulate too. There are a sort of certain psychological states which I don't know, I don't have words for, and I think most writers would say that too about themselves. But I'm trying to think if there's any. I can't think of any actual subject on which I would feel I shouldn't or don't want to. That's an interesting question.
Yes. Well, look,
I'll have to go
and
away
it's
and think
one
about
that
it.
sadly we will not be able to pick up more on because we're coming very quickly to the end of the show. Helen, thank you so much for being so incredibly generous with your time and with sharing your thoughts and your literal diaries. So thank you very much for joining me today on Backstory.
Thanks. It's always good to talk to you, Mel. Thank you.
It's such a pleasure. Thank you. Thanks so much. You've been listening to Helen Garner in conversation on Triple R's Backstory. We've been with you live and we've been talking about Helen Garner's collection, One Day I'll Remember This, Diaries from 1987 to 1995, which is out now through Text Publishing. I'd like to thank everyone who's been listening or been watching via the Triple R website or socials. Huge thanks to our events team, Bez Zoder and Dan Dare. If you happen to miss this special live streamed conversation just now, you can listen back on demand or watch it via Triple R's website, Facebook, YouTube channels, all of the above, watch it on everything at once, whatever you like. I am going to be on a break for the next couple of months, but this seat will be filled with incredible talent. So keep tuning in. And up next is the ever wonderful Beth AQ with more great stories about storytellers on the Glasshouse. I may even, full disclosure, make a cameo on that as well, talking about one of my books of the year. I am going to take you out on a track and a sponsorship announcement. And yes, just remind you that you are listening to and or watching Triple R. So please do stay with us. This is The Poets of Antiquity with Sad.